Okay, so this class is on plant growth regulation, or maybe more specifically, plant height control. Um, Here's a picture. So sometimes you might say, well, why bother? What's the point of this? What's the big deal? Um, Going back maybe 20 years, buyers for plants didn't seem to really care as long as they had the right number of plants. And then about 10 or more years ago, buyers got more educated, more specific on numbers and the size and shapes of plants, especially flowering plants. And that meant that growers had to pay attention to what the buyers wanted. And the buyers didn't always have realistic expectations and they were adamant. So growers had to adapt their growing to make the plants suit the requested needs. Now, a lot of the times that was to make it more marketable, right? This is a lot like when I talk about you're going to the produce section and you pick something, and by picking something, you're voting for that, right? And so when a customer is going through a garden center and they pick a particular plant, what they pick is their vote, and that feeds back to the buyers, which trickles back to the farmer and reinforces certain things and gets rid of other things. So that's how this whole growth regulator market came to be. Um, in this particular picture here, you can see that the flowers are buried within the foliage, and that's just not acceptable. We need to have the flowers on top of the foliage as a bare minimum for something to look at, right? So this is something we can control. Um, the other thing is trying to keep plants in a suitable format for a pot size, right? So if you look, there's this tiny 6-inch pot down here for this huge dahlia. That's just not appropriate. So a grower has to contain the plant in the most compact, well-presented size for that particular size pot. Um, is it always reasonable? No, but markets dictate. You take a dahlia, for example, most dahlias would be pulled out of the pot and planted in the garden. But what the buyers find is that the customers don't want to buy a dahlia bulb. They want to buy a dahlia. And then as the years went on, they don't want to just buy a dahlia. They want to buy a dahlia that's in full bloom. And that becomes increasingly challenging for the growers to do that. It's not that they're asking for this. This is what the market dictates. That's when they vote, when they go buy stuff. All right. Here's a pansy. Looking at different pansies. If we let a pansy grow without any growth regulation, it becomes very floppy and falls over. Especially you hit it with a stream of water, and then next thing you know, they're all laying on their side. So growth regulators are used extensively for that production. So in today's lesson, I want to talk about different methods for controlling plant height. And these are the major categories. We'll talk about lighting and climate, chemical methods, and then some nutritional methods. And I'll squeak in one other method in there. So let's start with lighting. Um, to review from your Plant Science 1, your red to far red light ratio, right? This is your red to far red light. That ratio dictates plant stretch. And a lot of that's to do with plants competing for light. So remember, when a plant overlaps another plant, it's filtering light, and far red light gets to the plant, not as much red, triggering elongation so that that plant can stretch past the other one. Of course, the plants just keep trying to compete past each other, and they get taller and taller and skinnier as they're reaching for the light. So we can influence light in the greenhouse, and we can do, here's just that picture reminding you of how that works. And we can do that by playing with spectrum. So blue light specifically is used extensively to inhibit auxin production, so a high blue. Uh, and in a sense, remember, auxin stimulates shoot and root growth, right? So auxin is something that is uh, produced at the shoot or the apex of the plant, travels down and causes all kinds of growth. And blue light has been shown to inhibit auxin production. So that would keep plants a little more compact and might slow them down. As far as the spectrum of blue, we can also increase the component of blue in our spectrum. If you see in this impatiens plug, we have sort of a tall, yellowy impatiens plug all the way down to sort of interesting growth formats. Now, the 100% blue has fewer leaves. It's a bit odd looking, but definitely 50% blue seems to be a sweet spot. So that's an example of where the spectrum of light is used to control growth. One of the other things we can do is play with the overall color spectrum. So remember, red, far red impacts growth, right? And so when we look at LEDs versus HPS, we can use LED lights that have lots of red elements to override that ratio with the PFR so that the plants stay a little more compact. And the LED grow lights we installed over our propagating bench have quite a few red elements. So they'll be very good for keeping our plugs more compact when we start doing bedding plant cuttings and seeds in the winter. So these pictures here show HPS, LED, and ambient. And the differences are subtle, but the HPS is still good. You know, in the past I've talked about how there's nothing wrong with HPS. In fact, we get radiant heat from it. But some plants, like this dianthus under the HPS, is a little more stretched, a little leggier. Most likely because there's a larger infrared component in HPS versus the LED elements. Rooting looks a little better for the marigolds under HPS. For peppers, it seems comparable. But under all situations, it's better than under ambient, which is interesting. They don't tell us the time of year here, so, but, you know. Lettuce, something we mentioned in one of the classes in root zone. Red lettuce, especially in the winter when the sun is low in intensity, LED lights are used to help make red lettuce red. In fact, this green lettuce here is a red lettuce variety, and it's grown in the winter months. And so when they start putting LED lights over the lettuce, as you increase the blue percentage of the LED elements in the light array, you get a more red lettuce. Now, from a practical perspective, from an energy consumption perspective, this is your better choice because red LEDs use less electricity and drive more photosynthesis. So this particular lettuce is going to finish sooner and has acceptable color. So in case you're wondering about LED lights on lettuce specifically. And blue again triggers the blue elements trigger that anthocyanin sunscreen pigment I talk about that gives you that purple color. So that's light. Let's look at climate. One of the biggest things that's used in controlling plants with climate is something called diff. That's an abbreviation for difference. And you calculate it by taking your day temperature and you subtract your night temperature. So here we got a 20 degrees C during the day, 18 at night. That's a positive 2 diff. So the day is 2 degrees different from the night, positively. A negative diff, right? This is where we produce short plants with short internodes. A negative diff means it's the other way around, right? Which means your nighttime temperature is warmer than your day temperature. Now that's a bit of a mind bender. Most crops, the typical delta is about 6 degrees Celsius. So if your nighttime temperature is 6 degrees warmer than your daytime temperature, you're going to have greatly compacted plants. Warmer nights versus, well, basically what happens is you have higher respiration rates at night. That means you're consuming sugars that might otherwise be used for growing. And so the plant has a little less available for elongation in the morning. On top of that, there's reduced flow of oxygen around the tissues in the morning, during the day especially. But with warm night temperatures, we're typically looking at a cooler morning primarily, right? This part here I wanted to highlight. Plant stems grow mostly in the morning. That's probably the most important thing to remember in this little section. So remember, if plant stems grow mostly in the morning hours, so we're talking from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. is when a lot of the stem growth happens. It sort of introduces a new opportunity, right? So I talked about how a negative diff, so having a warmer entire night versus a whole day, will disrupt the flow of sugars and cause more compact plants. But if the principal time of day is the morning where stem elongation actually happens, we can actually adopt a different technique called a drop or morning dip. And that basically what happens is that the greenhouse is cooled rapidly in the morning by about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. So the first 2 to 3 hours of your day, this is done. And that effectively elicits the same response as having a full negative diff. So where you have to maintain a warm night temperature for the whole night, here all you're doing is creating this differential. So the plants will look at this really cold morning as the sun's coming up, the air temperature is quite a bit colder, and it thinks, man, the nighttime was a lot warmer. And that shock disrupts the flow and in the time when the plant's trying to mobilize sugar and cause rapid stretching and move water. So it's a powerful tool. Again, the optimal diff is around delta 6. Every crop's a little bit different, and that requires some experimentation. Um, this is something I've been trying to encourage some cannabis growers to adopt to cut down on labor and shaping their plants, right? Strengthening their stems for holding flowers. Um, One thing to keep in mind here that's important with this, and that is this requires cool seasons. So typically, if you got your greenhouse, right, you got your greenhouse, right, and you've got, remember we talked about energy curtains that close at night to keep the heat in. So nighttime, you've got warm air in your greenhouse floating around, and you have cold air above your energy curtain because the windows are up there, right? It's cold. And then when you open your curtain, this cold air dumps down onto the crop immediately, and you get sort of a really abrupt shock in temperature. And that's enough to elicit a diff drop morning effect. So that only works in cool seasons. So we're talking early spring, winter, and late fall. So your daytime temperatures are still fairly warm, and you can do this. Now, summertime, maybe depending on the crop, if it's a really heat-loving crop, you can do it, but generally speaking, it's not applicable. Um, so you're limited with your seasons for applying this, right? That's just one of the things we can't get around. This is a little diagram I made to help you understand a positive diff. So nighttime is a normal cool temperature. We raise our temperature during the day, and then we cool off again for the night. Where a negative diff, we have a warm night, and then we cool off for the day, assuming that's possible, and then we warm up again for the night. Now, of course, a full diff means you're heating the greenhouse at night when there's no sunshine. So maybe you can close your energy curtain, but you have no benefit from the sun. So this is a more expensive way to control heat, but sometimes it is the only way available to us because of some plants are just not sensitive enough to a morning dip, and so we have to do a much longer diff treatment. But the morning dip would look like this. You have a normal nighttime temperature and a normal daytime temperature, right? But just before the morning starts, we drop the temperature massively for a couple hours, and then we let it come back up. And that gives us the same as if we were doing a negative diff. Whoa, I missed that. Just terrible accuracy there. Now, some of you may remember that I have talked about an evening dip with tomatoes, right? For steering sugars into the fruit. The same thing applies, but this is not about being compact. Remember, stem growth happens in the morning. Sugar mobilization to the fruit happens in the evening. So we can do a dip at the end of the day, and that drives sugars to the tomatoes because they're staying warm. We'll talk a bit more about that again as we do the vegetable course in the winter, but I'm just going to keep repeating it subtly so you remember. So again, diff for height control. So we need only treat plants for a few days. Sometimes we get confused by this when I'm teaching this lesson, and students think that, oh, it's the entire crop. No, anywhere from 2 days to maybe 14 days, depending on the crop, is all you need. Another important factor to keep in mind is that it only works when the plant's in an active vegetative growth phase. So remember your juvenile, vegetative, reproductive phases. So only when it's really actively vegetatively growing will you get a good response to diffing. There is a species dependent response. So there are some species, not many, but there are some that just are not sensitive to this. So that requires you to do some homework to figure that out. And again, I mentioned you need a cool climate, right? So it's not going to work in the tropical climate. And on a side note, for certain crops, let's say you're doing a fall mum, maybe a late mum, say you're a weekly pot mum grower, and you're trying to diff your mums to keep them compact, but you're using incandescent bulbs for photoperiod control to keep it vegetative. The light that comes off these bulbs produces infrared, right? And that infrared has been known to reverse the effect of diffing because it sends such a strong stretch signal to the plants. It just means you got to be really careful that you don't use those incandescent lamps longer than necessary. Some farmers have it dialed down to maybe 15 minutes in the middle of the night, 20 minutes. Some might leave the lights on for 4 hours, just, insurance, they might say, but they don't realize that that 4 hours of incandescent light is stretching their plants. So keep that in mind. Looking at the difference between both diff and drop, remember drop is the morning temperature drop, just to keep things clear, where the diff is the full night. Diff works best on slow growing plants. So we're talking, herbaceous, non-herbaceous plants, perennials, plants that just are slower to grow, right? They need a bigger push, as I say here. One of the downsides of diff is that it can slow the entire crop down so that you might even miss a ship date. So it takes longer to finish a crop when you're doing a full diff because you're treating for the whole night. You're using up sugars for the whole night. So it takes longer for that plant to mature. So it takes longer, which costs you money. It also causes smaller and more horizontal leaves, but smaller is probably the bigger thing here. So keep that in mind. As far as the drops, that's the morning dip. It saves energy because you're not doing the entire night. A real bonus is that by cooling the air off, you can open the curtains like I suggested, but you can also open your vents, right? So cold air drops and hot air escapes, which means that you are dehumidifying, right? Which is always a good thing for reducing disease. A morning drop has less of a delay on your crop, so your ship dates more or less stay pretty close. Not to mention, when you're shipping, especially shipping to garden centers, that morning drop, that wild swing, actually hardens off the crop, makes them a little tougher, so that there's less of a shock when they leave the greenhouse and get shipped to some other location where they don't know what they're going to see. So, a couple of pros and cons. This slide is just reviewing something I taught in the first part of the term, but just remember that cool temperatures with high light, we get compact growth with thick leaves. So that's kind of where I was trying to say that it might improve the quality a little bit. But the downside is that, cool temperatures with low light causes thin, small growth. And warm temperatures with high light, we get rapid with thick growth. This is your turbo, fast possible, but you may get stretch. And of course, warm light with low light is not good. So the key thing here, what I'm trying to say is that if you're using cool temperatures, supplemental lighting may not be a bad idea. Because you don't want to have this situation where you get thin growth. All right, one last thing. I'm going to put it in the climate category, but technically it's not climate, but I suppose it is because it's external to the plant, and that is mechanical motion. I don't know if you can see in this picture. This is just a gray PVC conduit pipe that's being dragged across these mini mums or mini roses. Sorry. This mechanical stimulation, I mentioned this in plant science too, actually causes the plants to react. And because their stem is flexed, they can sense the flex, which is pretty amazing. And in response, they actually thicken their stems and stiffen their stems, which means there's less energy to stretch, so they become more compact and more sturdy. The big $10 word, let's see if I can do 10. Oh man, I cannot write with a mouse. Maybe it's because I'm left-handed, but I mouse with my right hand. That's really unfortunate. The $10 word is thigmomorphogenesis. There you go. You can tell that to someone you love, and they'll be really impressed. Thigmomorphogenesis. There's a link on that. If you click on your PowerPoint version of this, you can take you to the. I think it's just an abstract, but that's probably all you'll read anyways. Which talks about this. There is a greenhouse in Burlington and Aldershot. It's actually called Aldershot Greenhouses, ironically, that grows mini roses, and they do this throughout their greenhouse. You know how I talked about how we have an irrigation boom at the college? They hang a pipe like this on the boom, and they just, as the boom goes, it drags across the crop. And their irrigation booms actually rarely spray water. All they do is drag these pipes over their roses. And they've almost eliminated their use of growth regulators as a result, which is pretty cool. They have had a fair number of boom breakdowns, though, because they are moving like 100 times more than the average farm. So we get thickened stems and delayed flowering, which means flowering, oftentimes in the case of this, we want to hold it off until the plant's fully developed. So that is a win-win. That's not always a win, but with mini roses, it's a win-win. Another thing I'll touch on, it's not used a lot in ornamental, but I have seen this in cannabis, is extreme wind or airflow. But if you think about it, it's really no different than what I just talked about up here. You're causing the plants to sway, and that swaying motion causes them to react by stiffening their stems. What I will say, and I've seen this and I would discourage it, is that the fans are left on all the time. That's not important. You're better off actually having gentle airflow for an even climate. And if you are trying to cut back on labor and stiffen your plants, you would put the fan on high speed, maybe only about half a dozen times a day. That's it. So you could have a second fan on a timer on full speed, and then one that's on all the time at low speed. That would be your best bet. Otherwise, your plant's wasting too much energy responding to the motion. Okay, let's look at chemical methods for height control. I know some of you will be uncomfortable with this because it's chemicals, but keep in mind a lot of these things are mimicking natural chemicals. But that's all to be safe. I'll say, you know what, you're right. They are chemicals. I wouldn't go putting them in my coffee when you run out of cream, but you know, they should still be treated responsibly. This is a long list. I'm going to cover some of these. I'm going to try to skip through this fairly quickly because I'll just put you to sleep. But there are some things I got to highlight because, you know, if you do end up in the ornamental world, I promise you, you will run into this stuff. So we have to cover it, okay? For the most part, if you go back to Plant Science 1, you remember learning about gibberellins, okay? Remember I hope they're using the picture. I love that picture of the cabbage where you've got like a regular cabbage that's a nice big ball, like a soccer ball size, and then there's a guy in a stepladder holding a cabbage that's like 20 feet tall. That's what happens when you apply gibberellic acid. It's potent. Just like this Arabidopsis picture here is showing. Boom, stretch tall when you apply gibberellic acid. So, and plus it promotes flowering, gibberellic acid. It breaks dormancy. Remember, you can soak your seeds. If you've got, you know, seeds that are supposed to be winterized and you didn't do it, just soak them in gibberellic acid. Anyways, the key here is stretch. That's the hormone that plants use for the most part to cause stretch. So what do? We use PGRs, plant growth regulators, and they act primarily by inhibiting gibberellin. So they bind it or they block it so the plant can't sense the presence of the gibberellin. So you don't get the gibberellic acid effect, right? So you don't get cellular elongation and division. You don't get stretch. That was hidden. Did you even see that? Possibly not. Sorry. I'm having a really tough day focusing. I don't know. I was just maybe all the excitement of, you know, plant growth regulators. Anyways, it's just not a coincidence that I'm starting with A, but let's start with A. Arrest or arrest. I think in the States it's sold under the label Abide. It is a anti-gibberellin. No surprise, we just talked about that. let me back up for a second. When we zip through these growth regulators, there's a few things that I want to highlight that you might want to know. For example, um, does it move through the plant? If it moves through the plant, that means that if you apply it on one part, it will diffuse through the entire tissue. Now, let me back this up because some of you probably panicked when I said you might want to know this. I'm not going to ask you any kind of question on a quiz or a final that says, what is the mode of action of a rest? But I might ask you, what does it mean when a growth regulator is mobile in a plant? So that's what I want you to know, that kind of stuff, the broader, more thematic stuff. Anything you can look up like this, so what? You can look it up. Why do I need to know that you know it off the top of your head? So make sure you understand what anti-gibberellic means, or anti-gibberellin. Understand what it means to be mobile in the plant, right? Where can you apply it? Keep in mind, if it's mobile, you can actually drench it to the roots, right? If there's your soil line. If you put it in the water, it will go in the roots and it'll travel up the plant from the roots. So you can drench it as well. So being mobile in the plant is really, really useful at times. Arest is probably one of the more broadly effective growth regulators. It's fairly expensive, so it's if you have crops that are not where other ones are not working or not effective, you might try Arest. But yeah, bulb crops are a good example. Although not many bulb growers get into growth regulators. That's getting pretty extreme, but it's possible. Phytotoxicity, right? That means that it causes burn on a crop. Some growth regulators, if you're not absolutely correct with your math, you can burn crops. You can burn the edges of leaves where the droplets form and concentrate. So Arest being a low toxicity growth regulator, growers that grow plugs, juvenile plants for sale to other people, these are high value, high dense plants. There's a lot that can go wrong. It can be a stressful thing to do as a grower. Very rewarding financially, but stressful. So a lot of times plug growers will stick with something tried and true that they know is not going to cause toxicity. In the sense, it's also safer, right? In that this is another important thing to remember, like mobility, is residual activity. I got all these lines everywhere highlighting things, but residual activity is really important, right? So if something has a really extensive residual activity, that means that if you spray it, it's going to act on the plant for quite a long time. That could be anywhere from a week to 2 months. So you have to be very cognizant of what the residual activity is. Some growth regulators are a lot more extreme than others. And so Arest is one that is somewhat limited. And if you think about it from a growing perspective, the more transient the PGR is, the more control the grower has, because they can pulse in some growth regulator for a slot to control the growth without fear of shutting the crop down for 3-4 weeks. So they go in, they give it a shot, it slows it down, then they let it grow again, then they might have to give it a shot a couple weeks later. They're pulsing in the control, right? And you can only do that when you have limited residual activity. This is another dahlia trial with different rates of arrest and trying to figure out what the best rate was. A lot of farms end up doing these kinds of trials in-house because it's not always the same, where 1 milligram worked for this person, maybe 2 milligrams works better at your farm. That can often be related to something as simple as the pH of your water. But at the end of the day, a lot of farms have to do these sorts of trials to figure out what rates to use that are suitable. These are excessive. The plant is overly compact for the pot, where these would both be, possibly even this one would be acceptable. So you have a fairly wide range. You get 0.5 all the way to 2 milligrams would be acceptable. So the nice thing about that is that there's a fairly wide margin for error, right? Psychocell. Matt's talked about this because it's the most commonly ones used in poinsettias. It is a foliar for the most part. Main reason why we foliar apply it is because we can pulse in smaller rates. It has a limited residual effect. If you drench, another common theme issue, yes, you can foliar, but you can also drench. But when you drench, you put quite a bit more in the soil, so it has a longer acting effect on it, a longer grown on effect. So be careful with drenching in terms of giving up some control. So yes, B9, which is another very common growth regulator used, partly because it's inexpensive. It breaks down very rapidly. This is probably one of the shortest residual effect growth regulators. Very mobile. You spray one part of the plant, it moves around the entire thing. And here in this Cosmo, you can see the control on the left and what a 3000 ppm spray of B9 did on the right. FYI, 3000 ppm is actually fairly concentrated. But remember, B9 is cheap, so it is actually very common. I consider it an old school one, but it is common and it's safe, so it's still used a lot. It's effective in a lot of crops, except the one key one is lilies. But you know, not many people grow Easter lilies anymore. A few. Buchenstein, Myers. There's not many. That market is disappearing. Like literally, probably COVID is wiping out more of them, but that generation is not longer around. So just think about it. Who do you know buys Easter lilies? Not many. It is also very good for seedlings, and that's the other place where I've seen it used a lot. You go in the ball grow book, oftentimes it's just standard instruction, B9 your seedlings at this stage. They can encourage branching and makes a more compact bedding plant. Interesting, most effective in cooler climates. So again, we live in a cooler climate for the most part, so we're okay with that. I used growth regulators a fair amount when I grew potted sunflowers. That was a long time ago. But you had to keep them short to sell. If they got tall on you, people didn't want them. So they're definitely, B9 is definitely a powerful growth regulator. This is a really cool one. It's called, the chemical name is paclobutrazol, but it's known as Bonsai. Piccolo is just a cheaper version made by a company in Guelph. Same thing, it acts on gibberellin, but it, I would say it's probably only recently become the most widely used because of its cost-benefit ratio. It doesn't take much and it's very effective. It does have a fairly long control window. So there's the difference between Bonsai and Arrest, right? So you're looking at season-long control. This is one that where the bedding plant producers often use it because you can't have bedding plants overgrowing at a garden center. People don't buy them. They try taking the pots. They can't get them apart. The flowers rip off. So by drenching them with Bonsai once in the crop cycle, those bedding plants kind of really stay compact. The downside is that when someone buys those types of bedding plants, they sit in their garden for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, not doing anything until the bonsai until they finally grow out past the bonsai. On a side benefit, it acts as a fungicide as well. It seems to retard the growth of fungus on plants, so your fungal infections are reduced. Very low rates. Remember I said it's a cost-benefit thing? 0.1 to 1 ppm. Contrast that to 3000 ppm for B9. So this stuff is potent. On a unofficial side note from Derek, you know, if you do get your hands on some bonsai and you don't really like mowing your lawn a lot in the summer, spray your lawn with bonsai and it gets super dark green and it won't grow for weeks. Little trick there. Couple other brands out there, Concise to Magic. Again, let's look at it. So what do we look for? You can do foliar, you can do drench. That means is it effective? Well, in this case, it does not move within the plant. So why would you do a drench? Because you're going to limit growth of roots. These are typically used with lilies, and lilies are interesting in that a lot of their sensory inputs are in the roots. It's a bulb. They grow roots. The roots are really important. Roots sense the temperature. They sense the climate. It's strange in that context. It's not like that in a lot of other plants. Um, yeah. Anyways, Sprenched, which is a heavy spray, long lasting at very low rates. Um, One of the things that's worth noting about a lot of these things, like these chemicals, last ones I talked about, Bonsai, some Magic, all these other ones, a lot of them stick to plastic surfaces. They're persistent on plastic surfaces and in soil. Now, a lot of times in the ornamental world, we don't reuse the soil. We ship it, it's gone. But we do reuse things like seedling trays and cutting trays. So if you ever use a growth regulator on anything plastic like that, really, you have to recycle it. Otherwise, you have to understand that it's going to potentially impact the growth of what you put in that tray next time. So be very aware of that. Other growth regulators that have interesting effects. Ethifon. This is sort of a your non-standard gibberellic growth regulator. This is one that actually causes plants to release ethylene. So it actually causes bud abortion. Some bedding plants, we need to make sure there are no buds for a while, partly because if they flower too early, the flowers will bloom out and fall off and then rot and trigger botrytis on your plant, which impacts the quality later. So if you can keep them from flowering for a little while and then let them flower at the right time, you don't have all the labor of cleaning it up. Hanging baskets are a really good example here, like this lobelia. They just drop stuff constantly, and everything underneath gets covered with these petals that rot. So yeah, not all PGRs are about growing, right? There's branching, there's flower, there's ones that encourage stretch, just like that Ethifon promotes flower, bud abortion. It also controls height, but it does increase branching as well, which is really a useful trait if you're trying to get a broader plant that has more flowering sites, right? Yes, it's illegal to use that in cannabis. I know someone's thinking that. Oagio, this is another interesting one, a fairly new one. I've got a link on here. I think I put the link on this week's folder as well if you want to watch plants grow. But it's pretty cool because they take a little spray bottle and they just barely spritz the plants, right? And it actually has quite an effect on the plants. And we're talking just a few droplets landing all over the place. It wasn't like a soaking spray. But it does chemically pinch, which means it's removing bud sites so that when it does flower, there's more flowers. So look at that. This is without it. This is with it. That's pretty impressive. So it promotes lateral branching, which of course is the same as taking, pinching the apical parts of your plants off like you did with your poinsettias. I got a lot of circles here. So pinching requires labor. If you have 500,000 pots and you want to pinch the apical meristems of them all, you're going to have to hire an army of people, right? So depending on the crop, like if it's hydrangeas, you just mow them. You go over with a mower basically and chop the tops off. But they're going to grow so much bigger over the season that you won't see the damaged leaves. Whereas with like a bedding plant, like a fuchsia, you can't do that. So you spray with a chemical pinching agent like Oagio, and that gives you way more flower sites and gives you a fuller looking plant. This is sedum. It's hard to see here. This is overdone. This is probably the sweet spot here. And this is with almost none. So the buds, you can't really see them, but they're buried and there's not many in the plant. Where in this one, the buds are above the leaves. Remember what I said in the first slide, and there are lots of them. So this is going to present really nicely. That's going to give your product the kind of sales you need. Configure. This is another one. I include this also because it's timely. It's Christmas time, and you go to Home Depot and Canadian Tire. I'm pretty sure that they've got Christmas cactus sitting on the shelves now. Christmas cactus is photoperiodic, but generally speaking, what we do is we spray it with Configure, and it actually triggers flower and branch set. So Christmas cactus, it's the number one thing. That's, you're gonna get all these buds that form on the ends of the cactus by spraying with Configure. It's basically abscisic acid. This is another one. Instead of like the other growth regulators where we're trying to block gibberellin, there's situations where we want to spray gibberellin. And so things like ProGib or FlorGib are synthetic variants of gibberellin. So it's like almost duplicate copy of the molecule, and you're spraying it on your crop. And what's interesting is that as far as strawberry production, something we do, you actually increase your branching and promote runners. So you can get a bigger, fuller strawberry plant by spraying with something like ProGib. And then if you remember from your Plant Science 1, I don't know if you've talked about that, but azaleas are sprayed with gibberellic acid because that makes them flower at once. Normally in azalea, they flower starting in the spring and it's sort of stretched out over a number of weeks. When you grow azaleas ornamentally, you want them to flower all at once. And so by spraying them with ProGib, it triggers all the apical meristem buds to go into flower at the exact same time. And you get this beautiful flush of flowers. If you take it home and you carry it on and keep growing it, you'll notice that it never flowers like that again, unless you spray it with ProGib. It'll flower sporadically through a longer period of time, but you won't get that huge flush. Another one, fresco, fascination. Probably fascination is one you'll run into. This is when you're trying to avoid leaves from falling off, so it stops lower leaf drop. So this is one that's blocking the effects of ethylene, so to speak, and it also prolongs flower life. So you can, can be used as a band-aid if you use too much of a growth regulator, right? So one of your gibberellin inhibiting ones, if you got the number wrong, you can correct that by spraying with fascination. Lastly, ethyl block is kind of a cool one. This is one that when you're shipping plants in a truck, or if they're in a cooler for a long period of time, you want to make sure that there's not too much ethylene. With orchids, what happens with orchids is that if they're in a box for too long, the flowers all fall off. And that would nothing more disappointing than growing a crop for, as long as it takes to grow an orchid. And then when someone opens the box at the flower shop, all the flowers are sitting at the bottom of the box. So oftentimes the crop is sorted into a finishing area and then sprayed with ethyl block to keep the flowers from falling off the orchids. They also sometimes have sachets that hang in the box that will absorb ethylene to keep the flowers from falling off. Okay, important considerations when applying plant growth regulators. So the plant has to be the correct stage of growth, right? So for the most part, that's the vegetative growth phase, right? The plant cannot be water stressed. That's a good way to get phytotoxicity. You want to make sure your plants are happy, healthy, growing, not stressed. And every PGR should be tested. Even if you're just trying a different cultivar, one you're not familiar with. Really important. Determine if your PGR is mobile or not. Don't just assume it is, check that it is. Because if it's not mobile, you have to spray to the point of runoff, right? That means that you cover the plant thoroughly so all the leaves are dripping. If it's mobile, you can get away with just spraying your crop willy-nilly and letting it move around. The other thing is consider your growing media. And what I mean by that is that, for example, bark-based media. So at times you see bark being used. Actually, in nurseries, I see this a lot. At the college, we've experimented with grow bark with different growing media, where there's wood, fiber, and bark in the media. And recent evidence has shown that bark actually interacts with growth regulators differently. So be aware that you may not get the desired effect with bark in the media. So here, for example, this pansy is not responding to the paclobutrazol. So not as much as peat and perlite. So just be aware of that. And then down here, you can see this is out of control, almost the same as the control here. Whereas the other two are responding to the growth regulator. I don't know what that is. Can't tell from here. Maybe a million bells or something like that. Anyways, just know that bark interferes with a lot of growth regulators. I wanted to look at this. This case. This is a link here. If you click on that, you'll see where I got this from. This is effectively a growth chart. So remember, a lot of growers, they track the height at different weeks of the growing season, and that's how they know if they have to apply a growth regulator. So what's happened here is that growth regulators were applied where all these arrows are, and the crop responded accordingly. And you can see right here, the crop was off the chart a bit. That's why we got these 3 brief cyclocell applications. Then there was one more application here. It didn't look like it needed it because it was on the chart, and that kicked it into the middle zone. But it looks like it was a heavy dose. Actually, I haven't read the paper. I'm just looking at this. And there's too much control, and the plant slowed down way too much. And here we have another input where the crop just sort of took off and goes back into the correct zone. So I'm guessing what's happened here is that this is cyclocell. There's a weak application here. It slowed the crop, but then it started to recover again because it's a transient growth regulator. But I think they overdid it. Probably should have done a heavier dose here, and then they could have skipped these two. Maybe one here, and this one possibly not even needed. Anyways, it's an interesting thing to look at. So you can see how growth regulators have an impact on a crop. Lastly, we have discussed this before, so it should be review. Nitrogen and phosphorus both impact height, right? If you supply a lot of nitrogen, it discourages reproduction and you get lots of growth and large internodes. And then, of course, phosphorus, you can either have it in excess, which causes stretch, or deficient, which causes compact growth. So in these pictures, there's some examples. This is tomato with phosphorus and without phosphorus. And look at the extreme. It's massive. Same thing as another tomato. These are sun impatiens. These are phosphorus deficient. So options for controlling growth. This is my review slide, I think. Yeah, my last slide. So first one. Right off the bat, before you do anything, choose the correct cultivar, right? Choose ones that have the growth habit you need, as close to it as possible. Eliminate shading. So first of all, that means don't be greedy. Don't have your plants so dense that they're overlapping each other. The other thing often neglected is make sure the greenhouse is clean. Is it dirty inside? Are there shadows? What's impacting penetration of light to your crop? And if need be, use supplemental lighting. Yes, it costs money, but it can also save you money, right? In terms of diffing and spraying and labor for pinching and whatnot. Limit the amount of phosphorus. So I'm not saying withhold it, but you can definitely limit how much is supplied and maybe even limit your water, right? Don't let them wilt though. Create mechanical stress. We talked about that with mechanical as in like bending the plants through some object or with wind. Increase air circulation, right? So getting plants that they're getting good flow between the leaves. That also means you're going to get good light. What else? LED lights, your red to far red, right? Make sure you get lots of red in the spectrum. Cut back or pinch, that's pretty old school. Like that's basically you give up. You're just going to go in and just do the lawnmower thing, which works for hydrangeas. Last but not least, plant growth regulators. Yes, what I spent the last ages talking about. PGRs. Like I said, if you end up in the ornamental world, this is just that's just life. Um, you wear your proper PPE when you spray it. Typically, growth regulators are not toxic or carcinogenic. I don't recall seeing any that had major warnings on them, unlike some insecticides. So, but PGRs are used quite a bit in the ornamental industry, so can't avoid that. Okay, don't forget that there is a quiz this week and every week till we're done this term, which is coming fast, really. Okay, see you in the greenhouse.